I'd like to welcome one of my dear friends and a seminal leader whom I've long admired, Rashad Robinson of Color of Change and Community Changes, Dorian Warren.
Thanks so much, Cheryl, and thanks to Netroots for this fantastic virtual convening of all of us. And I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with my dear brother, Rashad. And I just want to jump right in, Rashad, because I've been pondering this speech I saw you give last year, that when it comes to racial justice, in big systems like criminal justice or healthcare, you said that we're still in the Underground Railroad phase of the movement. So can you explain what you mean by that? The Underground Railroad phase, not the emancipation phase.
Well, yeah, I mean, why I said it is because I do think that sometimes we think we've won more than we actually have won. We think we are further along than we actually are. Lots of times we are working to diversify racist structures rather than tearing them down. We sometimes think that if we can just get inside of the system, we can make it sort of align to fit what we need. And it doesn't mean that, right, the Underground Railroad is bad when you have it, right? It means that in these moments, you have to work inside of the system, but you can't let that work inside the system make you think that you don't want to tear down that system. And so this actually comes down to this idea at Color of Change of not mistaking presence for power, which I think is very important in this moment as we are on the front pages of the news, as we are trending constantly as a movement, as we are getting shout outs from the stage from all sorts of people that would have never talked about our issues, that we recognize that in so many ways there will be those that come along and work to co-opt our movement. But the thing about presence to power is that when we mistake presence for power, we think that we've done something that we haven't done. We will think that a Black president means that we are post-racial. We will think that a lot of people celebrating Black celebrities means that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture. And America can monetize, celebrate, and lift up Black culture and hate Black people at the same time. And those two things don't have to be so in conflict. And so I do think that it's sort of really important is that we have to continue to look at all the industries that shape our lives, from Silicon Valley and Hollywood to all the ways from ExxonMobil to Goldman Sachs to Walmart, all of the ways in which corporations continue to sort of put their hand on the scale. Corporate power anywhere is a threat to racial justice everywhere. And if Wall Street is celebrating this current Democratic ticket, we need to know that that does not necessarily mean good things for Black homeowners. Now, I'm not trying to create false equivalencies between the two tickets. What I am saying is that we have to be conscious of what winning elections and getting inside of elections means for our long-term efforts, and recognize that while we might be trying to win short-term victories, that should not take our eye off the ball around the long-term goals and the long-term winning that we have to put forward.
So I'm always struck when you talk about presence isn't power, because it reminds me of what I just grew up hearing from my grandmother, my mother, my family, and that is Black faces in high places isn't power, right? And we've talked a lot about this notion of, yes, we're a multiracial democracy, but what we don't want to become is a rainbow oligarchy, an oligarchy meaning ruled by the rich few. So why is corporate power still one of the several blind spots in our movement? And what do we need to see differently in this moment to take on corporate power and get off the, get beyond the Underground Railroad to the emancipation phase of the movement?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this actually comes down to power. Power is the ability to change the rules, to create consequences, to force those who make decisions to have to actually sort of consider us, is a way in which we can build a whole movement on Wall Street focused on inequality, but it's not real power. It's simply a conversation. I think the nightmare, right, for me in this racial justice moment is to be a topic of conversation, a T-shirt that people keep in their drawer that reminds them of that moment, that sort of time when they were speaking up and chanting and using hashtags, but not necessarily a movement. I think the single most important measure is our ability to build power and to leverage power and to force institutions to have to do things that they don't want to do. Not simply saying that they're with us, but actually having to do things. And, you know, like you, Dorian, I know we've talked about this a lot. I grew up in a home where Ebony and Essence came once a month. Jet came once a week. We were told this story, right? If we just work hard enough and we get inside of these systems, that, you know, every month and every week they would like list the Black folks that had achieved and got inside, the new mayor, the new police chief. If we diversify police forces, if we diversify corporate boards, that in and of itself will lead to sort of a set of change that will be at the level that Black people need. And I think what we have to recognize that these systems diversifying alone do not actually lead towards justice and freedom. In fact, in so many ways, because racism is such a shapeshifter, in some ways it helps to protect those systems. It doesn't mean that we don't do that work. What it means is that we can't do that work at the expense of building power and building movements that actually challenge those institutions, that push those institutions to do more and create real progress. I think about this in terms of even our work in criminal justice, right? In all of the ways, we just saw the announcement from the New York Fraternal Order Police, the New York City Fraternal Order Police endorsing Donald Trump. We watched the Cook County Fraternal Order Police march on Kim Foxx, the district attorney elected to move reforms, right? They marched on her, completely their constitutional right, because she had decided that she was going to stop prosecuting low-level offenses. The first Black woman district attorney, they marched with the Proud Boys. They marched with white nationalists. They showed up to her office as reported by the Chicago Sun-Times. They took pictures of the first Black woman district attorney. They rubbed them on their crotches in full view. And then the next day, they put on their uniforms, their badges, and their guns, and they went back into our communities. And so the question here is not a question about hearts and minds. This is a question of power. And power will allow us to get to a place where we can downsize policing, where we can invest in the things that we need to invest in and divest from the things that we want to. But we have to constantly recognize that the only way those police officers get to do it if the major corporations in that city are okay with it. If the only way that the Fraternal Order of Police in New York City can endorse Donald Trump is if their police foundation can continue to get money from major brands and major corporations that also say that Black lives matter. We have to recognize, and this is important for all of us as we work to get rid of Donald Trump, that we have to also defeat Trumpism. And we have to keep our eye on the ball about what is the long-term goal about dismantling the systems and structures that continue to profit from our pain and the incentive structures and the enablers that will allow it to happen.
So there's so much I want to dig into there. And what you raised a whole bunch of questions for us and food for thought. I, like many of you watching, rewatched the John Lewis documentary recently. And we are still mourning and honoring him. And, you know, as the old saying goes, mourn and then organize. And I was struck, Rashad, by watching some of that footage, particularly of his speech on the March on Washington. And you'll see a Bayard Rustin standing behind him, smoking a cigarette. It's very not politically correct, but cool. and Bayard Rustin is one of those folks that was also focused on corporate power, right? In 1963, he wrote an essay in October after the August March on Washington about questions of corporate power and political economy and the plight of Black workers in particular, and how the civil rights movement needed to solve some of the economic questions and corporate power questions, in addition to the inclusion questions. So I raised John Lewis in particular because we know that he was not just a fighter, he was a winner, right? He fought the good fight, he resisted, but he won some big things. So help us make sense of the challenge now and the strategy of winning massive structural change in our democracy. How should we be thinking about winning strategic campaigns that advance racial justice and take on corporate power at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, you just sort of raised so much from, I think, the sort of role of Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and Ella Baker and so many others who had a deep view of power and people power to push back on a wide range of systems. and structures that were hurting us, and recognize King talked about sort of all the ways in which the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act didn't cost America anything economically, and that the next fight would have to be about the sort of billions of dollars to actually deal with the plight that of Black folks, that it didn't matter if you could get to the lunch counter if you couldn't afford to buy a burger once you got there. All of this, I think, is incredibly important because racism is resilient. Like water pouring over the floor, it will find the cracks. And it will find the leaks, and it will constantly leak through because it's so resilient. And the power structures of racism are so resilient. And that's why our movements have to not have sort of short-term visions about what's possible. I think the thing that I think about so much about John Lewis, Congressman Lewis, is how much policy change and rule change happened during that period of time. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were sort of force multipliers in terms of legislation. And as a movement, there had to build all sorts of legal and political infrastructure to defend it. And the right built infrastructure on their side, right? They built all of this infrastructure to be able to protect it and to fight against it, to protect their things and to fight against ours. And we built infrastructure to protect it. And all of these things were happening at the same time. And we watched the right, in concert with corporations, work to dismantle things like the Voting Rights Act and take away Section 5, to chip away at equal protections that we had won and gained. But it took them a long time because that's the power of winning rule change, is that your opponents have to consistently chip away. I do think this moment is one of deep culture change, of deep culture shifts to change what's acceptable and push up the ceiling on what's possible. I think about this in terms of our Hollywood work and all of the ways in which we're trying to shift the sort of rules and norms about what's acceptable on TV, how race and racial justice is portrayed. I think about the crime TV shows on TV, and that for the last 20 years, violent crime has went down. But according to Pew Research and others, Americans believe that violent crime is going up. And so this gap between perception and reality creates all sorts of demands for a certain type of policing that allows for people to invest in policing in our communities rather than actually having corporations pay their fair share so that water is clean and schools are funded and parks are there and mental health is available. And so the next phase, the future, right, of how do you hold on to culture change? Because as much as we are trying to win cultural victories, like changing what the public sees as the role of prosecutors and changing what prosecutors see as their job, which is all about narrative power. As much as we are working to change those things, our opponents are working on the other side. So you don't change culture without cultural infrastructure. You don't change culture without being able to reach people through narrative infrastructure. And so for everyone who's watching, we are going to have to work to hold on to the new awakenings that people have as they see that Amy Cooper video in Central Park and maybe see themselves or members of their own family in that video, and recognize that they might want to wake up, but we have to know that change is not inevitable. And that in order to win, we have to be able to reach people. We have to be able to control the media narrative. We have to be able to, at scale, move our own stories. Because if we can truly win the type of cultural change that shifts what's acceptable and pushes up the ceiling on what's possible, that then will open up the possibility for a new set of policies, a new set of rule change. It means that we have to hold folks like Silicon Valley accountable, who might say they are our friends, but will put their hands on the scale if it means growth and profit. They will ignore security and safety on their platform, ignore the impacts on democracy if it means that they can their bottom line can increase. We can never once again mistake our presence and our visibility for power. We cannot mistake our stories being on the front page of the news for the fact that we have won. That is the importance of infrastructure, and that's beyond any single leader. That is about having organizations and institutions that are ready and willing to engage in the effort of power and using power to shift what is possible and to win the type of justice and freedom that our people deserve.
So Rashad, I know we have 1 minute left, but I want to ask you one last question, because you've talked really brilliantly about the narrative power we need to shift culture. And we've been talking about corporate power, and having gotten my start in the labor movement, I understand the role of disruptive power with strikes and consumer boycotts when necessary. We're in an election cycle, so that gets to electoral power. There's also governing power. What are all the forms of power we need to, in a minute or less, what are all the forms of power we need on the table to really make this moment a transformative moment in terms of racial justice, in terms of our democracy?
Yeah, I mean, we need to be looking at narrative power, cultural power, political power, electoral power. When those levees broke in Katrina, which is about 15 years ago, right about now, and a flood that was caused by bad decision makers that turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. It launched so many different organizations and so much different sort of work. It also illustrated things that people already knew: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and the ways that structural racism undergirds all of those things. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people: government, corporations, and media. And so at every turn, as we work to build power, I want us to make sure that we are not just thinking about, do people care about us? Are they empathetic? But are they nervous about disappointing us? Because empathy gets us charitable solutions to structural power. Power gets us structural change. And that is actually what we have to win. And so as I sit here and think about the 400 years of Black people on this land, as I think about the indignities and the exploitations of Indigenous and Native people, we can never expect people to simply care about us if they are not willing to act in concert. And that has to be the standard by which we think about power, and that has to be the standard by which we fight for change.
With that, that'll be the last word for this section. Thank you, Brother Rashad, for inviting me to be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Dorian. Love you, brother.
Love you very much. And I'll toss it back to our greatest host of all time, Cheryl Conti.
Dorian, Rashad, you took my breath away. Thank you so much to both of you for bringing your energy and your ideas and your vision to this space. Fortunately for us, your presence is power. That was electric. And I love the inspirational idea of shifting what's possible. And whether we're coming together to reimagine a new vision for community safety, an end to abusive ICE policies, or Indigenous land sovereignty, our struggles are interconnected.